Hi guys and welcome back to Is It Worth It channel. Today we are talking about another streaming DAC, but this one is interesting, I promise. It's Innuos Pulse Mini. And this one goes around 1000 US dollars or euros depending on where you live and pricing and taxes in your country, etc. But it is a really good one, so stay with me and let's find out why. Let's quickly go over the build quality. This is completely made out of metal. These are some sort of metal sheets. They're not particularly thick or premium looking, but they're nice and sturdy and they just look really nice. And it's not plastic, that's always a plus. Front is interesting. It looks like some broken surface. I'll put some pictures of it because I'm not sure that you can see it like this. But you can notice that there are no buttons, knobs, controls, or displays of any kind. So once you turn on this streaming DAC, the only thing you can press is small hidden button below the front panel, and then small white LED will light the surface beneath the device itself on the top of your shelf, showing you that it's powered on. And I don't know if you like that. I kinda like that because I like my hi-fi devices being inconspicuous, but I guess that's just a preference. Now, the interesting stuff is of course on the back of the unit, because looking at that we can talk about connectivity of this device. And as you can see, we have a LAN port, which is like our network input to make this one connected to the internet and your home network, so you can stream audio files anywhere from your home network, PCs, network storages, or internet streaming services, such as Qobuz, Tidal, or Spotify if you don't really care about your sound fidelity. I'm just teasing with Spotify, but it is of a noticeably lower audio quality than Tidal and Qobuz. And then you can see USB inputs, so you can attach local storage directly to the streamer. Ethernet output, I haven't even checked that in the manual, but it might be useful for some use case scenarios. And then on the left side of the unit, you can see two digital outputs, coaxial and optical, for your digital audio stream. And next to them, you can see one pair of RCA single-ended analog outputs that are utilizing internal DAC of this unit. So as you can see, there are no balanced outputs here, and the internal DAC, if I'm not mistaken, I read that a few days ago, is produced by Texas Instruments, meaning that it's a Burr Brown chip, because they belong to Texas Instruments now. And we'll get back to these outputs and their sound later on. For now, I wanted to say that the software side of things is quite decent, but with some small caveats and annoyances. For example, Innuos app is really rich and functional, and I like that. Support for many streaming services is there. Support for internet radios is there. Everything is functional. The user interface is logically laid out and it looks nice. And I didn't have any problems using the app. Also, everything functioned nicely and I never encountered any sort of problem connecting to any service or network. Everything just worked as it's intended to. The only thing that I'm not so fond of is that there are small loading screens very often. So for example, if I open Tidal streaming service, I see a loading screen. That's okay for the first time. But if I go back and I immediately after that enter the Tidal streaming service again, loading will be there again. The same is for the whole app. If I minimize it on my phone to answer a message, for example, and immediately reopen it. So bear in mind, I didn't force close it, I didn't delete it from my memory, I just minimized the window and then I called it back. 5 seconds later, the user interface is loading for a short period of time again. So these small loading screens can be seen quite often in the native Innuos app, And I'm not a big fan of that. It's slightly disruptive in terms of experience, but other than that, everything works really nice and functionality is great. And I guess if I had to choose, it's better to have really functional, well supported and laid out app that loads a little bit than have quick app that's glitches and bugs and does not support functions that are maybe important to you. So pretty high grades for software, but it can be better in my opinion. I would really like to see most of these loading screens go away in the future. I hope that's something they can do with future updates. When it comes to how Pulse Mini actually sounds, I'll divide that impression into two parts as usual. First, we'll talk about its digital outputs if you want to use it only as a digital platform. So you're connecting it to an external DAC. And why would you do that, you may ask? Well, if you already have a great standalone DAC, but it does not have streaming capabilities. You use this one as a streaming platform, digital transport, connected to an external DAC. And I've used mostly coaxial SPDIF output because that's my preferred choice for now, and hooked Pulse Mini to Gustard R26 and also my own do-it-yourself tube DAC, which is even better. And I was really happy with how Pulse Mini sounded. First of all, tonality is quite neutral and I would almost call it flat. There is no excessive warmth, there is no excessive brightness. Everything is quite neutral. Detail retrieval is great. Everything sounds crisp and clean, edges are sharp, well focused, instruments are well separated, and the sound stage is pretty decent, pretty good when it comes to width and depth and just overall size. And in isolation, I really couldn't find anything to complain about. The easiest way to fully assess the sound quality and how good it actually is to compare a device to everything else that you have of a similar price and see how it fares to its competitors. And I started with something that's actually more affordable, and that's a Bluesound Node. And I have to say that digital outputs of Pulse Mini are of a higher quality when it comes to how they sound. Everything is slightly crisper and cleaner and more precise. Compared to it, Node sounds a little bit hazier and even slightly blurrier. It's not really when you listen to it in isolation, but compared to this clarity of Pulse Mini, it does sound like that a little bit. And the sound stage is better layered and separated with Pulse Mini and has better sense of depth than Bluesound Node. Their tonality is pretty much comparable, they're detailed, open sounding, plenty of air, of brightness, but not too much. The bass line is again comparable, but that fine detail retrieval, clarity, crispiness and sound staging is better on Pulse Mini, and it does sound like a higher tier streamer compared to Bluesound Node, and that's basically it. I still prefer Bluesound Node's software because it works a little bit smoother and it has really great support, but Innuos is not far behind at all, and because of its superior sound fidelity, I would rather use it than Bluesound Node. My second comparison was with Eversolo DMP-A6 that I really liked. If you haven't seen that video, please go watch it because it's great. And this was a much tougher nut to crack for Pulse Mini, because Eversolo is kind of overachiever, at least a little bit. And when you compare them directly, even though Pulse Mini lacks nothing in isolation, you'll notice that DMP-A6 sounds a little bit more spacious, and that especially goes for soundstage depth. Background has slightly darker, cleaner feel to it, and notes are emerging like cleaner and better defined from that background. Also, tonality of Eversolo and Innuos are slightly different. Innuos is definitely brighter sounding with more mid-range and upper mid-range focus and emphasis, whereas Eversolo sounds slightly fuller in the bass and mid-bass section, giving more a tone body, like more body to instruments, more core to vocals, and they sound a little bit more palpable and juicier. But sometimes those higher frequency crunchy details will sound more emphasized on Pulse Mini, but with less of that tone body and tone core. And that's just a slight tonal difference. You might prefer one or the other depending on the rest of your system and your room acoustics. But the most noticeable thing for me was that Eversolo creates slightly bigger soundstage and pinpoints and layers slightly better inside of it. It just sounds a bit cleaner, bigger and lusher. Is it a huge difference? No, it's not. But if you're really into making your system sounding the best you possibly could, it does sound better, and I prefer it to Pulse Mini. Now, the software side of things, it's, I don't know, pretty equal in my opinion, with Eversolo having slightly smoother, like quicker user interface. Once you load the Eversolo app, you rarely see any loading screens or delay, everything works really smoothly, whereas Innuos have those short loading screens from time to time. But I would argue that Innuos app is functionally more mature, because some things like managing your playlists, your songs that are queued for playing, you can arrange that more thoroughly with Innuos than you can with Eversolo, which is still a little bit bare bones in that regard. So functionality-wise, I would give that to Innuos, but like smoothness and presentation, I would give that to Eversolo. Lastly, if you ask me how the digital outs of Pulse Mini compare to something like hifi Zen Stream, this one sounds slightly richer in terms of fine detail retrieval, and I believe slightly wider in terms of sound staging. Soundstage depth is quite similar, tonality is similar. Both are great streamers, but I would give a slight edge to Innuos Pulse Mini. Yeah, it does sound better. Now, is that difference worth the price difference? I cannot tell you that, that's up to you, but Pulse Mini does have a modest fidelity, sound fidelity advantage compared to Zen Stream. So yeah, you'll have to figure that for yourself. Now, moving to the analog outputs and using internal DAC of the Innuos Mini, I have to say, first of all, that it's really well integrated. Everything that I mentioned about great mid-range detail retrieval is still there when you use the internal DAC. Clarity is great, transients are quick, and sound staging is quite decent. Once again, sound stage is really wide, it's reasonably deep, overall tonality is open, bright and airy, and it doesn't particularly lack anything or emphasize anything in an obvious way, at least. I will not go into each standalone DAC comparison separately, but I quickly attached Topping E70 Velvet as a standalone DAC to this unit just to find out that I actually preferred internal DAC of Innuos Pulse Mini. So if you really want to noticeably upgrade its sound fidelity compared to its own analog outs, you have to go to a higher tier DAC. Something that's at least SMSL SU10 level, Musician Pegasus, Leder Schumann, and ideally Gustard A26 R26. Something like that would be a good standalone DAC upgrade to this streamer. Below that, around $500 US, no, it wouldn't. So once again, I did the same comparisons as in previous section, just this time using its analog outputs. Once again, I first tried Bluesound Node. and the difference is quite noticeable, and there is at least one tier difference between these two. Mini Pulse is more resolving, it's cleaner, crisper, everything is pinpointed exactly in its position a little bit better, and if you listen to it for some time and then go back to Bluesound Node, it will sound a little bit murky and hazy, just not as resolving. So yeah, that's it. I will not talk much about that anymore. Next one was the more interesting one, once again with Eversolo DMP-A6. Interesting thing happened. That advantage that Eversolo had over Pulse Mini when we were using their digital outputs completely melted when we are talking about their analog outs. In fact, I even slightly preferred Pulse Mini's analog outputs when I compared them directly on their single-ended outs, to make things more fair, because Innuos Pulse Mini only has single-ended outputs. It sounded slightly richer in terms of micro detailing, inner tone texture, and just that sense of tone richness, especially in the mid-range and upper mid-range section. Everything feels a little bit better textured and crunchier and more natural with Innuos than it does with Eversolo DMP-A6. They're roughly in the same tier of performance, but DMP-A6 has, if you listen to it directly after Pulse Mini, it will feel like somebody just a little bit artificially cleaned out the tones and the whole sound. Every instrument or vocal, they feel supremely squeaky clean, but I find myself lacking a little bit of texture and that micro grit from real life sounds. Without being overly sensitive here towards everybody's feelings, I'll say this. If you're a beginner audiophile, there's a chance that you might think that Eversolo DMP-A6 sounds a little bit cleaner and better and more hi-fi. But if you have a little bit of experience and you learned to listen more critically and your system is really good and really resolving, you'll actually notice that all of that cleanliness is eating a little bit of fine details and fine textures that this Innuos Pulse Mini can offer. The thing is much more even when we are using balanced outputs of Eversolo DMP-A6. If you can utilize balanced outs, that will lift performance a little bit, and Eversolo becomes slightly more energetic, engaging, lively sounding deck with more energetic tones. They still retain that great sense of clarity and cleanliness, and I don't know, in that case it's much more evened out battle. I would still argue that Pulse Mini, on its single-ended outs, because those are the only ones it has, sounds a little bit richer in the mid-range and more natural, but Eversolo, on its balanced output, is outmatching it in terms of like pacing and energy and just how lively and engaging it sounds, but it does sound a little bit more hi-fi, like great clean sounding hi-fi, and in that case I'll leave the decision to each one of you. But if you're limited to single-ended connection only, then I preferred Innuos Pulse Mini. So it actually has a great analog section, great DAC that managed not only to bridge that gap that digital section of Eversolo had, but slightly surpass the analog section of Eversolo, to my ears and in my opinion at least. Roughly speaking, they're in the same tier. You might feel differently than I do. And this actually leads me to the conclusion. Innuos Pulse Mini is a really good sounding device. Actually, if you use it as a digital streamer, it's a really good sounding device. If you use it both as a streamer and a DAC with its analog outs, it's a great sounding device. Its platform and OS and software support is robust. Some things can be improved slightly, smoothness and like user interface, but mostly it's a robust, well-behaving streaming platform. It doesn't have anything really fancy about it, like huge display or I don't know what, but the core of the device is functioning well and sounding really well. And if a streaming deck with single-ended outputs is what you need and you can spend this much money, this is definitely one of my top picks that I would be looking at this price point, because it just performs really great. If you would only want to utilize its digital outputs to use it as a streamer, as many of my friends do with more capable standalone deck, then it's still a good device, but I would advise you to take a look at Eversolo DMP-A6. Take a look at that video that I made a little bit earlier on this channel, because to my ears that one does offer slightly better sound fidelity and in general better value if you are using it as a digital platform only. That said, I cannot omit that part that Innuos is a traditionally distributed brand, meaning that you can buy it locally. You can go to your hi-fi dealer, purchase it. If there is any problem, you're covered by warranty locally. They'll handle everything, they'll resolve the problem, whereas everything that you purchase online, like these Eversolo products, they're great value, but they come with some related risks. Like if anything goes wrong, you'll have to ship it back, you'll have to wait for a much longer period of time for everything to get resolved. So I don't know, that's your choice, like traditional brands with traditional old school distribution compared to online selling only. But my general opinion on this is that if you want a whole all-in-one solution, both digital section and analog section to use them together, Pulse Mini is an absolutely great offer. If you want only that digital platform and digital outputs, then I would rather use Eversolo DMP-A6. If you have any personal thoughts on this topic, feel free to share it down below in the comments. Click that button, subscribe please, so this channel can grow and bring you even better reviews, even more reviews, and see you next time. Bye.